So, looking at gaseous exchange in insects, I'll be using a grasshopper as a model organism. So, the main kind of point to get across here is that although insects are multicellular organisms, they are actually small enough for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be transferred between the inside of the organism and the external environment by simple diffusion. So, as in, the insects don't require an advanced ventilation system, so the gases can just move by simple diffusion straight from the outside to the inside of the insect, and vice versa for CO2. So CO2 can move from the inside of the insect to the external environment by simple diffusion. And there are three things that allow for this to happen. So firstly, the concentration gradient. That is always maintained. So there will always be a far lower concentration of oxygen inside the insect compared to in the surrounding air outside of the insect. And that allows oxygen to diffuse from the area of high concentration outside to the area of low concentration, which is inside the insect. And the opposite for CO2. So there will be a higher concentration of CO2 inside the insect because it's a byproduct or a waste product that's made from respiration. And there'll be, compared to that, a lower concentration of CO2 in the surrounding air outside of the insect. So CO2 will diffuse from the high concentration inside the insect to the low concentration outside of the insect by simple diffusion. Also, the diffusion pathway is relatively short. If we compare an insect to something like a human, the diffusion pathway is obviously a lot shorter. So it means that these gases can travel by simple diffusion from the outside to the inside. And also, if we're thinking of the size of the insect, we know that organisms that are very small, such as insects compared to humans, they have a much higher surface area to volume ratio, allowing for this diffusion to happen. So there is a problem here, and it's to do with the fact that insects have a thick, waxy exoskeleton. So they do not have an internal skeleton. Their body is held together by this hard exoskeleton, usually made of chitin. And it's really thick and waxy. And what that means is that it's also impermeable. So things like water and gases cannot penetrate the thick, waxy exoskeleton. And the main reason the insect has that is to keep itself waterproof. So it doesn't just dissolve in water. That would be a huge problem when it rained, for example. So to get around this problem, what the insects have along the abdomen and some also along the thorax are these things called spiracles. So spiracles, they're effectively holes along the abdomen and the thorax that allow these gases and water to actually get through. So the gases can move from the external environment to the inside of the insect, or from the inside of the insect to the external environment via the spiracles. So they are these little holes along the abdomen and a couple on the thorax. So that's the main way that the gases can move across, is through the spiracles. If it weren't for the thick, waxy exoskeleton, the gases and water could diffuse straight into the insect. It wouldn't need the spiracles, but obviously then it wouldn't be waterproof. So also, because insects are multicellular organisms, they do need some kind of system that allows for oxygen to reach all of the cells on the inside of their body. And that's what we're going to look at next. So that's called the tracheal system. So they do have this kind of tubule system inside of their body from the spiracles that actually allows oxygen to reach all the cells of the body. Because if it was just simple diffusion straight across into the insect, the O2, the oxygen, wouldn't necessarily reach all of the body cells. So that's another kind of system that the insects have to get around the problem, and we'll look at that next. Okay, so this is showing the tracheal system, which is a kind of network of tubes inside of the insect. So I'll just do a quick review of the pretty terrible diagram that I've drawn. So what it's showing is the final half of the thorax here, and then the abdomen at the end here, okay, of the grasshopper. And what we've got is the spiracles here along the base. So typically, grasshoppers, for example, have around 18 spiracles, and what we've got is one pair per each body segment. So insects have their body split up into segments, and there would be a pair of spiracles per each body segment. So there'd be one on this side and one on the other side of the insect. So yeah, this just shows what's going on inside the insect in terms of the tracheal system. So here I've got larger tubes directly coming off of the inside of the spiracles, going deeper into the insect. And those bigger tubes, they are called trachea. Okay, and the trachea, they branch off into smaller tubes called tracheoles. So here I can see that my trachea break off into these tracheoles, and what that allows the oxygen to do is to kind of reach all of the body cells. So here I've got the body cells which surround the tracheoles and the trachea. So the trachea and the tracheoles work as a team to guide the oxygen into all the parts of the insect on the inside so that they reach all of the body cells, and it also means that all of the body cells can give their CO2 back to the tracheoles and the trachea to be released out of the insect via the spiracles. Okay. And just to note that some larger insects do also have air sacs. So grasshoppers are an example of a larger insect, and they do have air sacs at the very end of the trachea. And what I'll do is I'll talk about why they're important in a little while. But not all insects have them, just note that, okay? So the main point here is that oxygen will diffuse into the tracheal system and into the body cells to be used in respiration. So it will go straight from the outside environment via the spiracles into the tracheal system, and then it will diffuse via the tracheoles or the walls of the tracheoles straight into the body cells. Oxygen is needed for the process of respiration. And the opposite happens with CO2. So CO2 is going to diffuse out of the body cells into the tracheal system, and then out of the tracheal system into the surrounding environment via the spiracles again. And that's because it's produced as a waste product in respiration. And it's a toxic product, so it has to be removed as quickly as possible. So I know that I said that gases are exchanged straight into the body cells, straight from the kind of tracheoles and the trachea, but that's not entirely true. So the site of gas exchange in the tracheal system is actually at the very end of the tracheoles in the fluid that surrounds the end of the tracheoles, and that's called the tracheal fluid. So oxygen will diffuse into the fluid from the tracheoles and then into the body cells from the fluid. So I've tried to draw it on, but the fluid is at the very end of the tracheoles here. And it's touching the tracheoles, and it's also in contact with the body cells so that oxygen can diffuse into the body cells from the fluid. Okay. So yeah, we know that air moves straight into the spiracles, but there has to be something to encourage the air to move in so that oxygen can move in, and then something to encourage the air to move out again. There still has to be that encouragement. It won't just happen. So the way that it is encouraged to move in and out is by a pressure gradient. So when the insect contracts its muscles, it causes the tracheal fluid around the ends of the tracheoles to be kind of sucked inwards and outwards from the end of the tracheoles. and that also allows the oxygen to kind of diffuse straight into the cells around it. And what this causes is, because the fluid has been sucked out of the end of the tracheoles, we've got a huge kind of decrease in pressure inside of the tracheoles compared to the air outside of the insect. And something has to replace that. So because we've got a pressure gradient there, it's higher outside compared to inside, air is going to replace the pressure that's lost from the inside. So air is going to rush into the insect to replace it. And vice versa, when the insect relaxes its muscles, the opposite is going to happen. So that keeps encouraging the movement of air into and out of the insect via the tracheal system. So I just want to talk about the air sacs quickly, because obviously they're on the diagram. So some larger insects, such as grasshoppers, they obviously have a larger surface area, a lower surface area to volume ratio if we compared them to something like an ant. They've got a lower surface area to volume ratio, and also they've got a longer length of diffusion pathway into the inside of the organism. So simple diffusion straight through the tracheal system is not necessarily efficient enough for these larger insects to get all of the oxygen that they need for respiration, and it's also not efficient enough to remove carbon dioxide so quickly. So what they also have are these little air sacs, which are at the very end of the trachea here. And they're actually for ventilation, so they give the insect a method of ventilating, or breathing rather. So when the insect flies, the flight muscles contract. And what that causes is it causes the air sacs to be squeezed, which forces air out. So the insect flies, flight muscles contract, air sacs get squeezed, and air is forced out of the tracheal system and out of the spiracles. And the opposite happens when the insect relaxes the flight muscles. So in relaxation of the flight muscles, it causes the air sacs to increase in volume again, causing air to rush in. So flight muscles relax, air sacs increase in volume, and air will rush in. And this is also to do with pressure gradients. So when the air sac is squeezed during contraction of the flight muscles, the pressure increases inside of the air sacs, which causes air to rush outwards. And when the air sac is opened out during relaxation of the flight muscles, the pressure inside the air sac decreases, which causes air to rush in from the outside. So it maintains this constant movement of air into and out of the inside of the insect. Also something to mention is, you don't need to know about this, but another thing to kind of know is that larger insects such as grasshoppers, they also have a system for alternating the opening and closing of the front and rear spiracles. So they've got the front spiracles at the base of the thorax, and then they've got their rear spiracles in the abdomen. And what they can do is, because the tracheal system is all connected here, even though I haven't drawn it on, it is all connected. The front ones in the thorax, so the front spiracles in the thorax, will open for oxygen to move in. And then the rear spiracles in the abdomen will then open for CO2 to move out. So they've got a more advanced system, but you don't actually need to know about that. But just in case you see any other videos that mention that, that's only in larger insects because they need a more advanced ventilation system due to their bigger size. And obviously if they've got a bigger size, they've got a lower surface area to volume ratio and a longer length of diffusion pathway. So even though this kind of normal diffusion with no ventilation system would happen in smaller insects, larger insects still need some kind of system to encourage air to move in and out more efficiently.